we are going to look at how to apply a spec map to a car in iRacing today. And I'm going to preface this by just saying I in no way claim to be a professional painter. This is just a method that I have found that works for me. It's a little bit of a trick I've kind of applied that doesn't quite follow the way iRacing has it set up in the template files you'll download here. I don't know if I'm doing it right. I just know that it's produced some pretty good results for me in iRacing based on what I've done here, and I'm just going to share how I do that. So I'll start by saying that, again, I'm an amateur at best. This is for people who probably are like me and have gotten some skill in painting, but are in no way able to sell their work. This is really just for those that are hobbyists at best. So I'm going to start here. I've downloaded the next-gen Camaro into Pixelmator, which is the program I use since I'm a Mac user. This is the program I've been using to draw up all of my paints. And right off the bat, there's a few changes I will make to the kind of default car file here when I download it in from iRacing. So one of the first things I like to do is I'll come into this paintable area layer up here, and I'm going to go into the car decals, and number one, I'm going to eliminate the 75th anniversary logos because, well, it's not 75th anniversary anymore. It is 2024. We're not doing that anymore. Another thing I like to remove from these, because it started to become kind of common, and in some of the designs I've been doing that's a little bit more unique, is I like to come in here and take off these painted side skirts so that I can actually apply my design down below that side skirt. When the next-gen car originally came out in 2022, the manufacturers of all three vehicles, the Toyota, Ford, and Chevrolet, all said, nope, that's our space, we're going to do our thing with it, you can't touch that. In the 47 car, they just started painting that last year at the Clash, and I thought it was really cool, so I kind of ran with it. One thing to watch out for, when you're deleting this side, there's a couple other parts here that you just want to make sure you're not deleting that out of. So that's kind of how I like to set my car up to begin with. Another thing I like to do, I like using the window blackout. Again, this is something that's totally optional. If you want your design to flow into that window area of the car, do that. Me, I don't. I like to have it kind of separated. So when I do that, however, though, that does give me a couple of other things I need to import. B-post logos, I go ahead and apply those to the car. You can see they sit one right on top of the other here on the B-posts, and they are upside down for some reason in the paint file. That's just how iRacing reads them, so that's how I put them in there. Next thing I like to do is I go ahead and I move this base layer down to the very bottom. I actually take it out of the paintable area, and I use all of my paints as groups. All the different decal layers, all the different layers that I'm going to add to the car. I like to put those in groups so that when I start importing those into the spec map layer, it's just easier to work with them. So I've gone ahead and I've imported my paint. This is my 2023 standard proof car, and for now I'm just going to use the paint and just kind of show that. I always import my numbers. I have them kind of already laid out how I want them to look, and their positioning is pretty standard, so I always import those. I have just kind of a file set up with those in place, so that has the nose, the rear, and the roof and left and right numbers are already in place exactly where I want them. That's going to be pretty standard regardless of what the paint looks like, so I like to import those. Then I also have all of my default logos that I put in here, so that includes my team logo up here on the front. For this car, I still have the Valvoline logo on the back. That's changed. This kind of gives me my paint layout, and if I go into my actual paint folder here, if you go and look at my paint layer here, so all the components of my car are actually separate in paint. So here's just the base paint. If I turned everything off on the car itself, you would see that none of that's still there. The striping is a separate layer. The shadowing on the striping itself, and then all the black areas. Now the reason I do that is because when I import that into the spec map that I'm going to use, those are all going to have different amounts, either shininess, glossiness, or matte color to them. So the way that this car was designed, all these black areas are pretty standard. I actually put it to where The default lighting spec mapping in iRacing is what's going to apply to that, along with any of the logos. So the numbers, any of like the name banners, these decals over here, the Cup Series, Goodyear logos, all of those will just get basically omitted from the spec map. And the way you do that is with black. Black is basically not recognized, and white would almost gray everything out. The two colors that are recognized for shininess and or roughness or gloss or matte are green and red, and the mix of the amount of green and red in those areas and how you apply them is how you're going to lay the spec map. And starting with this car, so I omit the black, I basically let it just be the regular shiny. All of this blue area gets a very matte finish to it, so it doesn't have as much shininess. It gets more of the roughness. However, I do still apply some shine so that it just gives it a realistic look. All of these areas down here, in where I've got the design that I pulled from the logo to kind of create the striping on the car, those are going to get a slightly reduced amount of, they're still going to have a gloss to them, but I give it a slightly different version than just solid black. So it has a little bit more of a shade difference. And then, so like these stripes that come across here, and then the actual borders of the numbers, I put more shininess to, so they actually have a lot more reflection, and they actually look like they're basically shiny stripes across the car. So, and building those out in each layer is the way that I do that. Okay, so let's look at how to apply the spec map. And if we start off by clicking on opening the custom spec map channel, you'll see that there are 3 different channels in here. So you see you've got 3 separate channels in the custom spec map. You've got the red channel for metallic, the green channel for roughness, and the blue channel for clear coat. Blue doesn't really get used in this, so right off the bat, you can look down into these and see that there's each layer has a parts layer, a base paint, and this blue channel, almost right off the bat, you can delete that. That does not need to be there. Now, the red channel and the green channel, the way that other painters will do this is they'll take those channels, is basically setting the level of shininess or roughness by the percentage of that color, and then setting that as a pass-through so that those 2 layers will show together. I've kind of started to bypass that process, so what I like to do is I like to take these parts layers, and I'll actually move this one up, and then I'll just kind of merge these 2 parts layers into one layer that doesn't really affect anything, and I'll move it out of the red channel, and at that point I can basically delete the channels. I really don't need them anymore. Now that I have my channels kind of laid, what I do next is I'll come down here and I will take all of my layers, so I'll take all 3 of these and I'm going to copy them, and I'm going to bring them right up here and I'm going to paste them into the custom spec map channel. I'll make sure my parts layer is all the way on top, because again that's going to be there, and then we're going to come in here and one by one I'm basically going to set the color of each layer to solid white. This is my black area, which honestly we can leave. It's already set to black, and like I said, we're basically going to omit that from the spec map, so we'll just leave that black. Now, starting with my base layer, once I have the color set, I'm going to come into the channel set, and this is where I'm going to basically set what the amount of shininess or roughness to get that layer to look like what I want, how I'm going to set that. So starting right off the bat, we know this is going to be a matte layer. So the red, which sets the shininess, I'm going to set that very, very minimal. I'm going to put it at about 10%. Then I'm going to come over to the green channel, and I'm going to set that probably about 55%. That's going to give more matte. That's going to come in. The way to think of this is how far away from black you're getting. So 0 would be black. It's not going to be there. Red, green, and blue all being 0, you're going to be black. We're at 100% on all 3, you're going to be solid white. You don't want that either, because that's just going to basically gray everything on the car out. So now we're just setting the percent away from black, and I kind of want it to just be in that neutral area. Not too much red, because I don't want shininess. The higher I take that red channel, the more shininess it's going to have. The higher I take the green, the more matte it's going to have, but if I go too far, then it's going to look almost unrealistic. Because keep in mind that especially in the Cup Series cars, these are all wraps on these cars. They're not painted. It's a wrap that lays on the car. So that's what kind of makes that perception of it. So I like to go about 55% and then make sure you come over to your blue channel and that goes to complete 0. You can already see that changes the overall look of this car to a pretty solid green look. That's going to have a good matte to it. It's still going to let a little bit of shininess through so that it won't just be completely drab. It'll have some level of, that 10% I put in there. And the way I like to check this is I'll just come take the dropper and I'll hold it over, and that's going to give you your red, green, blue percentages. So on this one, it is 25 for red, 140 for green, and 0 for blue. So that's pretty good. Alright, next I want to come up to this center layer, which is my overlay for the colors that are the striping underneath those. What I wanted to have is a reflective stripe. So I'm going to do the same thing there. I've already colorized that, but for this layer, I'm going to come back to the channels, and we're going to put a lot more red into this. So this one's going to be a little bit more neutral. So maybe we go about a 55 on red. Green, we can go about a 45. And on blue, we'll just 0 it. And you can see that's going to give it kind of this brownish color. If I want to get that more where that's going to be kind of a balance, but it's still going to look very matte. So that's probably not the way I actually want that to look. What I really like to do when I'm doing a gloss layer that's going to look like glossy paint on the car, I'll start with red and maybe just do that 20%. Green, I want less of that, so maybe do like a 10%. And then remove the blue channel. Now you can see that looks very black if you're looking at it, just looking at it from far away, but if you zoom in, you can see that I've got about a 51, 25, 0 is my color shading on that. Again, keep in mind, this is just my distance away from black, so the closer I am to a color shade of black, it's still going to be glossy, but maybe not as glossy as, say, these parts on the other areas of the car. That'll just kind of take it away from black a little bit, still give it a little less gloss so that my logos and things like that will still differentiate, because I like to have the logos almost look like they're an actual sticker that is placed on top of the other areas of the car. So having that a little less gloss than the other area and with a little more shine or a little different shine than what the logo looks like, that just makes it look different on the car. I kind of like the appearance of that. Again, this is something that really, as you go in and you import this into the paint shop on the car, you kind of just have to feel it out and see what your preference is. You may have to come back, put it back to white, adjust those levels, and just get a feel for it. Alright, so next I'm going to go to, I have those black stripes that kind of accent the striping on the car. So these areas are going to be very small, and honestly on this, I'm going to go just sort of to that same amount of matte, just to put a little buffer between the striping and the design of the car. So if I remember, I did 10% on that, and I did 55 on the green, and for blue we did a 0. So it may not show up very well on here, but you can see that there's just a small area between where I had the white stripe here and this design area on the car. Right, so next is the striping areas, which we want to put, we don't want them to be full reflective, but we want to put a lot more reflection into those, so those are going to show up very red on this. And the way I'll do that is kind of going the other way, so I'll start in the red channel, and I'm going to go probably about 75% on the red, and on the green, we'll do the opposite, maybe 5 or 10%. And then we'll eliminate the blue. And there you can see that puts a very, very vibrant red on there. I'm going to put a little bit more on the green. So that's going to show up very, very shiny on the car. When that's actually on the track, you'll get a lot of the reflections from the lights, from the sun, depending on the shadowing, other cars. It'll show the environment in those little stripes. It's a subtle little area, but it just kind of adds some highlights. And the nice thing about that is when I actually import like my decal layers, those stickers will go over that, so that'll put breaks in the shininess, so like where the numbers kind of cross that, that'll build that section out. So the numbers are a little bit different on this car, and just because I do have a border around a white area, what I'll normally do with these, and just to give an example, I'm going to use the number on the roof to show kind of what I'll do. And generally, I like to colorize these to 100%, and then just get them to be, actually I'll go the other way on these, because I want them to be just slightly off that solid black. So for my red channel, I'm going to do maybe 10%. On my green channel, I'll do 5%. Blue channel, do 0. And so, I mean, you can barely see that number showing in here. It's there, it just doesn't show very well. But that'll just put a slight difference between that omitted area that is going to be gloss on the roof of the car and that number, but the white on the number is going to show very, very brightly with that. Now, I will import the exterior shape of that number, which I've already got in a separate layer on my car I'm actually referencing all of this from. So there's what that layer would look like on the car, where basically the number itself is going to be a completely different color, and the border of the number is now in that very, very bright red. That's going to be extremely reflective around the number. And just add a little more vibrancy. Now I'll do the same thing here to the rest of the numbers, and sometimes what I like to do when I'm doing this is I'll basically take these, merge them all into one layer across all the numbers, because I want them all to be the same. So if I merge that into one single layer, colorize that to the solid white, and then we'll do the same thing. We're just going to come into the channels, and we're going to give them very, very minimal. So 10% on red, 5% on green, 0% on blue. That's going to give me the same thing. Now on this number, I do have underneath of it, there's a border on the sides to kind of separate it. That's supposed to have a very matte look to it. So same thing. Let me colorize that to solid white first. And then I will do basically my same matting that I did on the other, on the outside parts of the mat of the car, which was 10, 55, and 0. And there you can see, so that'll just put a little bit more separation between them. Again, just like any other paint, just make sure that the layers, obviously the parts that I want to be matte on top of the reflection or on top of the gloss parts have to be on top of that in the layer order here to make sure that it shows through. So the only other part I really have to do is take these logos, which I can kind of do the same thing. I can do a merge group here. I'm going to colorize that entire channel to solid white, 10 on red, 5 on green, 0 on blue, and there you go. So now those logos will show up and kind of cover that same thing. In the interest of time, I'll show kind of what the rest of my decal layer looks like. I'm just going to bring that in to this car. One thing you want to make sure of when you have your decal layer is that you also bring in all the decals that are in the paintable area. So all the car decal layer, which is going to have your series decals, your Goodyear logos, any of the stickers that are on the car for, you know, the branding, the Camaro logos. You'll also want to look at the color change logos, which is your Camaro logos, or for whatever logos those are, that those are brought in as well, just because you're going to want to reference those and give them basically the same color definition that you're going to give every other logo on the car. So if you look in to kind of the finer points of this car here, where I have the Camping World logo, that is on top, so that logo will block out that highly reflective area of this stripe as it's going across there. You can see some of these other logos, what they actually look like inside of the area. So this is kind of really what the final version of the spec map file is going to look like. Now, one other thing I like to do is just for, I mentioned I kept that kind of parts logo. I'll do the same thing. I'll colorize the channels all the way on that just to black so that they're almost ignored completely by the spec mapping and whatever the default lighting is for those, because most of what is on those parts logos are going to be any of the areas of the car, so like the lights, the decals, things like that. The banners for where the names are on the front and rear of the windshields. You want to make sure those are there. But one thing to point out is right now that side skirt area that I painted has its own shape in that parts layer. If you don't want to have a separate look to that, if you want to keep the same look as the rest of what this car has, make sure you delete those off of there as well. So I'd go just select and delete that to make sure that it didn't show up in the paint. And then I'd do that just to make sure there was no leftover marks on it, and that's going to give me a pretty solid look on the car. Now this is a little bit different from what the actual car looked like, but let me show you a finalized version of basically how this paint comes out. Basically kind of how the car looks if I'm focused on how this whole spec map is going to look. Now if I didn't apply a spec map, it's going to be very uniform all the way across. Every logo, every piece of paint, it's all just going to be the same. And any paint scheme looks really good. I think iRacing does a very good job of just default lighting on these cars. But if you look at this, you can see here in the striping how reflective that is because of that extreme red that I had in there. These areas of the car where this design is, it's got some reflection to it, but it's not as reflective as the stripe. You can see the amount of detail in the stripe and environment that shows there versus you don't see as much in the design area. Same thing on the numbers. That high red that I have around the numbers, that shows as extremely reflective, where the number itself, the body of the number, not as reflective because that's more matching this area. You can see here on the roof of the car where the black is, that's got some reflection to it, where all the blue area is very, very matte. One thing I really like though is how you look at the standard proof circle here, how that's got reflection, and when you see that kind of in comparison, or the Aeroleds logo across the back of the car here, how that, the comparison of reflection in the actual sticker versus what's on the matte area is completely different. Overall, I really like the way that this car turned out specifically. I've done some different things for cars this year. This was the Darlington car for the fall of 2023. It came out really, really good, and especially at a race like that where you start in the afternoon and the race ends at night, the difference in lighting from the track and the environment kind of applied to all of this looks really cool. But all that to say that by using single channels and just kind of playing with the levels of the red and green in that individual channel, it's how you can kind of create these effects. It's going to take some toying around with and just playing with to figure out how to get those pieces to look the way you want. There's going to be a lot of importing and exporting out of the paint shop to get an idea if it's the right amount of reflection, if it's too much, or if it's not enough, because you'll start to lose some of the color value. Keep in mind that all the spec map does is take whatever color is underneath of it or is in the design of the car and apply how much, whether roughness or shininess, is to that specific color. In some of the early spec maps I did, I would put a logo, take the standard proof logo for example, and I would make it extremely reflective in the white parts. Well, what happens with that is you almost lose the visibility of the color because something like a solid white with extreme reflectivity becomes very, very gray looking. And it just becomes difficult to kind of follow. So a great example of that is the standard proof logo on the hood. It's a little difficult to see here, but this ring around the outside, if you look at the spec map here, I made that extremely reflective. I made it completely red. So, but that ring, if you look at the actual paint on the car, let's turn off the spec map. So here's the logo itself. When I apply it to the car, it's very white. It's got a kind of a cream color to it. And when you look at it on here, it's almost, you lose that coloration because of the amount of reflection on that. It becomes very, very gray or silverish looking. So just making sure that that's where I don't go 100% on the red for a lot of the reflections. I'll try to dial that back to maybe 70 or 80%, and I'll add a little bit of matte to it, maybe 5, 10, 15%, just to bring that color to still show underneath of what that spec map looks like. Quick little tutorial on how I do spec mapping. Again, like I said, I don't know that I'm doing it right. This is just how I do it, and I've found really good results out of it. You know, the way these cars have started to turn out, especially when you start playing with different levels of spec mapping. I love the way that these stickers kind of come across highly reflective areas, and the difference between matte and gloss areas just adds a lot of definition. So even this, I mean, this is a very basic paint scheme if you're just looking at it without any of this. It's some striping, you know, I just took the colors of the logo and put that across the entire car, and then put a stripe design across those bars just to kind of add something. But what really made this stand out was the spec mapping to do the very matte areas of blue and the gloss roof and the gloss areas around the car, and the difference in the way that lighting hits that, especially with the reflective areas, just builds more character to what otherwise would be a pretty basic paint scheme. So play around with it. It's just kind of an idea of how to do this stuff. I thought I'd give a little tutorial on how I do it. I use Pixelmator for all of my paints just because I paint on my Mac. There are plenty of equivalent programs out there. If you're using GIMP, you can do a lot of these same things. I know Photoshop is probably going to be your best bet for any of this kind of process. I'm not going to spend Photoshop money. Pixelmator was $30 on the Apple Store, so I just went with that as my preferred design. And there is a new version, Pixelmator Pro, which actually has a little bit better coloration, but it does not allow you to export in .tga files, so that's why I use this. Hope this helps. Sorry this was long, this is very drawn out. I'm just trying to explain all the little different pieces I put into how I paint cars. Share your designs, let's see some pictures of it. Of course, you can follow us along on our Facebook page and share a lot of that stuff. And get out there and go win some races. See you, everybody.